All right. Welcome, everyone. It's good to see such a great turnout, really. We truly appreciate it in the Jewish Studies program. This is part of a wonderful series, whether you know it or not, and I was just handed a flyer that is a testament to that fact. So I'd like to read out just something in the way of formalities at the beginning, so read out a paragraph from it. In 2001, Rita Rosenberg established the Fund for Yiddish Language and Culture in the Serling Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel, and this is what brought the remarkable Dr. Murav here to MSU. She's part of a long list of very accomplished historians and literary experts, and I assume there are multiple disciplines represented here. I don't know everyone. I know a fair amount of them, and I've been, I think, to most of these talks over the course of my career at MSU, so it's certainly wonderful to welcome Dr. Murav to be among this august company. I gather the list is not fully comprehensive, but if you're interested, you can pick up a flyer, and we'll certainly give one to you, Harriet. So I'd like to read some formal remarks initially and then offer some personal reflections, I think, on the importance of Dr. Murav's work and how I know about her. So first, the preliminaries of her really remarkable career. So Dr. Harriet Murav is a Center for Advanced Study Professor Emerita in the departments of Comparative and World Literature and Slavic Languages and Literatures at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, the author of 6 monographs, 5 co-edited books, and articles on Russian and Yiddish literature and culture from an interdisciplinary and comparative perspective. I can certainly attest to that. Murav has also co-translated David Bergelson's Judgment and a selection of Yiddish and Russian stories in the shadow of the Holocaust, forthcoming from Stanford University Press. She also co-edited a volume of essays on the Yiddish poet David Hofstein, which is forthcoming in 2026, and her new project is Living Out of Time, which focuses on the theme of time waiting and wartime in contemporary Ukrainian poetry, and I would say some of these are most certainly present on what she's going to speak on today, as The Dust of the Earth, The Literature of Abandonment in Revolutionary Russia and Ukraine. So it's a really humbling list of accomplishments and very inspiring to scholars like me. I'd like to begin by just acknowledging what I hope is evident to everyone, that is, there's a horrific war still going on in Ukraine. Last night, Russia launched some 70 ballistic drone missiles and 450 drones, according to President Zelensky, on what is a multi-confessional, multi-ethnic population. Ukraine was only able to intercept a portion of these, and many hit their targets, further damaging Ukraine's infrastructure. Kievans and Ukrainians across the country are now forced to survive on very little in the way of heat. Some have no heat whatsoever, in temperatures hovering around minus 20 centigrade. And today we visit this land historically and through the prism of literature and other parts of the former Pale of Settlement in the former Russian Empire, when a very different kind of violence occurred, but a violence equally, if not more, horrific. It is this legacy of trauma and abandonment that Harriet addresses in her work with a sensitivity and, I would say, empathy that few have matched. There's a lot written on the pogroms, but I really urge you to pick up this book. My students read one chapter in it, a seminar I'm teaching on nationalism and national identity in the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. And we had a great conversation today, and it is available in ebook format through the MSU library, so there's no excuse not to read it, although I always recommend picking up print copies as well. I marked mine up completely. We all will be better off having read this work. When I first met Harriet, well, let me first back up. We have a number of sort of intersecting relationships, I would suspect. So I was trained at Indiana University by the great Ben Nathans before he went to University of Pennsylvania, and Jeffrey Weidlinger before he came to University of Michigan in what was then called Russian Jewish history. It was, in fact, Jewish history that covered the entirety of what was the Soviet Union and Russian Empire. But I learned very much. I learned a great deal from these colleagues, and I learned so much from literary scholars such as Harriet, who speak, I think, to our sensibilities as historians. So I first corresponded with Harriet as a reviewer for Slavic Review. So when I was pretty early on in my academic career, and she told me right away, so she was a longtime editor of Slavic Review. Those of you who know the field know this is the journal everyone wants to publish in. It is the flagship journal for our main professional organization. And Harriet, through her stewardship of Slavic Review, brought a lot of great scholarship to the fore. And I was just a humble reviewer, but she asked me to call her Harriet right away. And I was sort of taken by surprise by this request, and yet found it horribly and wonderfully collegial. She's inspired generations, I would say, of scholars, but most certainly graduate students at the University of Illinois, and students, I'm sure, before that at the University of San Diego, is there?
Davis.
Davis, University of California, Davis. Many of whom at the University of Illinois I have come to know, or at least come to know their work. I work on Odessa, and there was a wonderful volume published on cosmopolitan spaces in Odessa, which included some of these graduate students from Illinois, whether they were yours or Eugene's or Mark's, I don't know, but there's been great work coming out of the University of Illinois for a long time, and I've been pleased to review some of it. So in her retirement, I've since learned she agreed to rather amazingly advise scholars from Eastern Europe, from Central Asia, from other parts of Eurasia, who don't have the access to what we have come to expect in North America, and frankly what MSU students are privy to. That is peer-reviewed journals and publications in the United States that are really now obligatory reading for anyone who wants to publish in a journal like Slavic Review. And I think that's a remarkable thing to help scholars who don't have that kind of access bring their scholarship to the English-speaking, English-reading North American market. But frankly, it's a market that transcends the borders, certainly of the United States. Whether it's for good or bad, this is work one needs to read. And so anyone who is engaged in the task of building bridges across our geographic, strangely, almost perversely geographic divides, I think is a huge credit to the field. Lastly, she has done what I would suggest a number of scholars that I know who have gone to do work in archives in Ukraine have not done. That is, in her retirement, she is learning Ukrainian. She will be among the first to tell you, as a student of language, that Ukrainian is not Russian, and it has its own challenges that one has to master as a student. So I never think it's a bad thing to learn another language. Harriet's convinced me I might someday fulfill my ambition to learn Yiddish. I toyed with a lot of languages in my career, starting in Russian and Polish, and then moving to Ukrainian and Lithuanian, and this is one of my last remaining. I could stand to relearn all these languages, but it's not an easy thing to do, and I just think it's a wonderful thing that she's dedicated herself to doing this, frankly, online with a great program at the University of Kansas. So I applauded, whether you need my applause or not. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Murav. Proszę.
So thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you to all the members of the staff who organized my visit here. It's very hard and it's a lot of work to bring one person from one state to another, and I really appreciate all the effort and labor that you've gone through. And thank you all for coming out on this kind of gloomy, snowy, cold evening to hear this talk. So this talk and the book, As the Dust of the Earth, is about a Jewish concept. And it's mostly about materials written in Yiddish, a Jewish language that's written in Hebrew characters but is Germanic in its grammar and has a lot of Slavic and, as I'm now learning, a lot of Ukrainian words. On the eve of World War II, most of the world's Jews spoke this language, Yiddish. But you don't have to be Jewish, know Yiddish or Hebrew, or have a background in Jewish studies to get my point. And my point is this concept of abandonment. I'm going to comment on the ways in which this phenomenon of abandonment was global in the 19-teens and 20s and persists through our time. So let's see if I can do this. Okay, so this is just an overview of the table of contents, which I won't read. So this book is about poetry and catastrophe, violence and relief work, artistic literature and documentation, injury and care. The analytic lens is the Jewish concept of hefker, H-E-F-K-E-R, and there'll be a lot of slides about it, originating in property law, the 2nd century, where it refers to objects that are ownerless and up for grabs, and it's still a legal term in Jewish law. So I explore in this volume the many meanings of this concept of hefker, or ownerlessness, as a legal, poetic, existential, and political term, showing how Yiddish poets, Russian language authors, I have 1 or 2 Ukrainian authors, aid workers, and medical professionals, all responding to the mass public violence or pogroms of the civil wars of the Russian Revolutionary period, use this term hefker to describe and conceptualize the experience of mass public violence, to declare a population or individual beyond the realm of law, to act with abandon, to abandon an object, to abandon your ego. These are some of the ways the term evolved. And the usefulness of this concept, as I hope to show you, extends well beyond the Jewish world of the first quarter of the 20th century. So just a tiny thumbnail sketch of the history of this period. Immediately following the 2 Russian revolutions of 1917, from this period straight through 1922, the civilian population of the former Russian Empire was caught up in civil wars, anti and pro-Bolshevik violence, wars of independence, Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine, for example. The remnants of World War I, there were still German soldiers on the ground in this region, French soldiers as well, and the chaos that all this upheaval created. The loss of state authority. There were at least 5 different governments, regimes in Kiev alone in this period, made it possible for not only national armies, but insurgent groups, local criminals, limited focus warlords, to exert unlimited power over the populations temporarily under their control. You can do whatever you want is something, a phrase I picked up in the archival materials. As many as 30 to 40,000 Jews living in this region were killed as Jews. Jewish organizations working with the Ukrainian and then the new Soviet government sent teams to the killing sites armed with questionnaires to try to create order out of chaos, this chaos. Poetry and documents even counting the dead, which sounds very sad and grim, and is. All these things, I argue, are forms of care. They're a way of restoring humanity to individuals who were abandoned. Okay, so these are some of the figures whom I use in the book. The wonderful Yiddish poet David Hofstein, the poet and prose writer of Yiddish Leib Kvitko, the, in my opinion, very beautiful Hadja Moladowski, the psychiatrist Dr. Fischl Schneerson I spoke about earlier today, a Scion of the Chabad dynasty who became a psychiatrist, the novelist and poet Itzik Kipnis, the very handsome Peretz Markish, the relatively unknown Dov Ber Levin, and the very well-known, but not for this, Russian theoretical critic Viktor Shklovsky, who also wrote in his memoir called Sentimental Journey about pogroms across the collapsing Russian empire. Okay, so these are some of the authors, and I'll come back to them, and these are some of the documents. So I did research in Kyiv archival collections, as well as one in Zhytomyr. These materials are available in the U.S. Holocaust Museum. They're also available at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. We acquired them. So this would be, this is a survivor account from the 1919 pogrom in Sovietna, northern Ukraine. It's written in Russian, but it was probably translated on the spot from the Yiddish, because your non-educated, simple person, really, a Jewish person at this time, did not speak Russian or Ukrainian or Polish, but Yiddish, and you'll see there's kind of cross-outs and inserts, so it raises interesting questions about, this is on-the-spot testimonial evidence, but it was changed. This is a very sad and but very revealing document. It's a list of the dead, and it shows here the age, and it shows the occupations. So this gentleman was a rabbi. This gentleman, Frank, was a tailor, and so forth. These very, very long lists of the dead compiled by relief workers. And this document in Russian is a meeting of the committee, the Jewish Social Committee to Aid Victims of Pogroms, known by shortened form Yev Obshist Kom. And these are the kinds of materials, in addition to published literary materials, that I worked with for this book, barely, of course, scratching the surface. There's many more materials. Let me come to this concept that is at the heart of this study, hefker. So here it is in Hebrew. It's not in the Bible. It originates in the 2nd century. Ownerless property and the renunciation of ownership. Property that is up for grabs can therefore be legally acquired by the person who first takes it. I leave my bicycle in the garbage dump area. I say it's hefker. You can have it. I bear no responsibility for it, though. So if it's defective and you fall, it isn't my fault. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. So other objects, the rabbis decided, are naturally ownerless, like the desert, like the sand at the seashore, the oceans themselves, and wild animals, and dust. Dust is also ownerless. Okay. There's a marvelous anthology or thesaurus of Yiddish by somebody named Naum Stuchkov, der Oitzer von der Jiddische Sprache, and as you can see, this is just one of the entries that has synonyms for hefker. No, I don't expect you to read the Yiddish, but here's the word hefker, hefkeris, and the words hefker dikait, or the state of being hefker. So, Herrschaft, rulerlessness. So hefker could mean ownerless, but it also came to mean anarchy, making free with others, being a kind of free and easy, careless person. So non-serious meaning, you could be called a hefker petrushka. Petrushka means parsley. I don't know where this expression comes from. It's very funny. So you're the kind of guy that can't be relied upon, or the kind of gal that's very lazy and careless, hefker petrushka. But it also could refer to the inability to have order or chaos. And there are many, many entries in this thesaurus that have synonyms for hefker. So it's one of these huge words. It means many, many things. Okay, so English words associated with abandon, because English kind of works in parallel, right? I can, an abandonment, desert, right? You can desert someone. You can leave them behind. You can renounce responsibility. You can disown. You can disavow. You can ban or outlaw or exclude someone. You can behave with abandonment. This is from Roget's 1911 thesaurus, a great source. So recklessness, wildness, wantonness, banning, exclusion, disavowal, disownment, renunciation, all these words are synonymous in English with the word for abandonment, and they give you some indication of how this concept of hefker works. This term, hefker, is not some term used only by elites in the Jewish world. Observant Jews to this day, when celebrating the Passover, the holiday that memorializes the going out from Egypt, you're not supposed to have leavened products in your home, and you clean your home of leavened products, but of course you can't get them all. You don't find them all. So you say out loud all chametz, leavened products, all the yummy things, bread, cookies, cereal, pasta, all that stuff, all chametz, leavened products, and everything leavened that is in my possession, whether I have seen it or not, whether I have observed it or not, whether I have removed it or not, shall be considered nullified and ownerless as the dust of the earth. And here's the word hefker. So that's where I got my title from, as the dust of the earth. What I explore by looking at the literary works and the archival documents is, what does it feel like to be like the dust of the earth? You know, what does it feel like to be nullified? And my argument is that the people who are victims of mass public violence, murder, rape, destruction of property, beatings, dislocation, didn't just sort of passively say, you know, I'm a victim, I'm a victim. Or they didn't only experience emotions. They thought about what was happening to them, and they conceptualized it, and they had a term ready to hand that they knew, hefker. And this stems with my dear friends who are historians, who sometimes say to me, oh, literature's great, full of emotion, full of just feeling. And I'm like, no, literature thinks. People use literature to think. Poems are conceptual. Novels think. And so this book tries to show that when people were victims of this dislocation, violence, upheaval, looting, they thought about what was happening to them, and they understood it in these terms. They understood that they were being treated as the dust of the earth. And this treatment didn't start with a revolutionary period. It started even earlier with World War I. Jews living in the western borderlands of the Russian Empire were right on the boundary with Austria-Hungary, and they were targeted from all sides. And I have a book, a memoir, by a Jewish man who called himself Milchomashtoib, war dust. That's how we were treated. We were war dust. We could be just moved anywhere, and no one cared about us. Jews were not the only victims of mass public violence. everyone in the former Russian Empire suffered from the chaos, lawlessness, lack of manufactured goods, the suspension of the economy. You didn't have to be Jewish to be a victim. And as an esteemed colleague once said to me, everybody was a victim, and Jews were especially so. But in other parts of the world, there was also mass public ethnic violence, the Armenian genocide, the lesser-known genocide of Assyrian Christians in northern Iran, and Viktor Shklovsky talks about these. On the other side of the Atlantic, right here at home, there was anti-black violence, Chicago's Red Summer, and the anti-black pogrom in Tulsa, Oklahoma, are examples of abandonment from the same time. The Tulsa race riot, which took place in 1921, right? It looks like a war. It wasn't a war. It was a pogrom. Black property and lives were destroyed with impunity. Black citizenship was forfeited. No one was held accountable, whereas there was documentation of the Russian Civil War era pogroms. In the case of Tulsa, evidence was destroyed, and the Red Cross was not allowed to set up aid stations in this region, the so-called Black Wall Street. The first official report on Tulsa was published, and this actually shocked me. It was stupendous. In 2001. 2001, there were reports coming out of late Tsarist, early Soviet Russia in the 1920s about this. Books were being published about it at the time, but we didn't learn about Tulsa in any kind of official capacity until 2001. So abandonment continues to be a global phenomenon, and there are many studies that have been published in the past 5 years that have nothing to do with Jews or Jewish life during periods of revolutionary chaos. Noam Leshem, a scholar from Israel, Life After Ruin, the struggles over Israel's depopulated Arab spaces, uses the concept of hefker. Yoel Biel writes about this asylum in Brazil, which is a complete zone of life in a zone of social abandonment. And the really fascinating anthropologist Elizabeth Povinelli writes about economies of abandonment. So this is a very well-circulated concept that historians, political scientists, and anthropologists, as well as literary scholars, are working with. They don't use the Jewish equivalent, hefker, but my goal in this book was to show the overlap between these two ways of conceptualizing what makes it possible for a group of people to storm a town and destroy everything in it. What has to take place for those conditions to obtain. So this is not from the 1920s. This is, I think this is some Italian Renaissance guy's drawing of a skeleton. Why is it here? Because the idea behind the theory of abandonment is that we're sort of temporarily clothed in privileges and rights, and these can be taken away at any moment. I mean, you know, I can't help it, as we saw in Minnesota. I mean, you can just lose your rights. People argue that when you pass through the airport security and your biometric data is taken but not preserved, you're told this is also, you're sort of being stripped of your right to privacy. I mean, I hope it's not preserved, but the lives of ordinary citizens are not invulnerable to governmental intervention that basically says you are no longer privileged, you no longer have the clothing and the flesh of rights and privileges. At any moment they can be taken away. So, I mean, we see this during wartime. We see this in peacetime as well. And there's whole bodies of critical theory on this subject, notably by the Italian theorist Giorgio Agamben. And you can ask questions if you're interested, but I'm not going to dwell. So the point here is sovereignty or government is the capacity to clothe and unclothe flesh in rights, norms, and entitlements, and to decide who gets them and who doesn't. All right, let me now turn back to some of the sources that I use, some of the literary and non-literary journalistic sources as well. So one of the points of departure from my study was a novella in Yiddish written by Yiddish author Itzik Kipnis, whose dates are 1896 to 1974. He writes an account of a pogrom in a small town or shtetl in northern Ukraine, Slovietsk, in July 1919, and he uses the word hefker. He writes, "Now we were like animals which at nightfall would become utterly abandoned, hefker, and helpless." And this was the kind of very cool title, Hadoshim, months, and Teg, days. So it's like a 100-page novel. So Kipnis compares people to livestock whose owner removes them of care, depriving them of food and shelter and security. And notice that he doesn't say the Jews were like animals sent for slaughter, which you might expect. He says they were like animals who were abandoned, and that's the pivotal point. It's seien wir geglichen zu beschäftigten, was in Abend wären sie in ganzen hefker und hilflos, totally hefker and helpless. So when I read this, I thought, there's a conceptual overlap here between current critical theories of abandonment and this notion of hefker. This was kind of the point of departure, one of the points of departure for this study. Another source for this term in a completely different light, and this is what I mean by talking about multiple meanings, the great Yiddish poet David Hofstein wrote a cycle of poetry dedicated to the pogroms and giving the profits from the book to an orphanage. The graphics for this pogrom cycle named Treuer, or grief or sorrow. If you know the word Treuer is a Germanic word, grief or sorrow, and the graphics were done by Marc Chagall. And so here's a picture of Chagall. This is Hofstein. This is a bad reproduction. I tried to make it big. And here across the figure is this red writing out of the word Treuer, and the last letter, the R, the Resh, has the form of the shofar, the ram's horn that's used to call Jews to prayer on Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. So Hofstein does something really interesting with the word. He writes, what can he do as a poet? What are you still in a position to do? The most beautiful, the greatest of pains, of sorrows. You can still receive a slight string of verses, rhymed and compressed, a slight string of verses on a crumpled page, drifting about someplace over there in giant baskets of years. So he imagines, I think he's imagining the poet as a kind of archivist. The poet is hearing or seeing these messages left behind by others, their expressions of pain. He isn't the unique creator of these words. He's just sort of compiled them and put them together. And then he says, and if you should have the fortune, if your song could be wild and pure as the bloody drops on the far snows of Siberia, would this not be comfort? And this is not the entirety of the Yiddish verse. And notice here, und sein wird dein Lied, and if your song or your poem could be hefker, not in the sense of abandoned, but in the sense of free and able to encompass a huge swath of other people's suffering and compress it down, and you could express this in a word, wouldn't this be comfort? Because that's what this poem cycle is offering, is comfort, acknowledgement of pain, ingathering of other people's pain, and it also includes like a wonderful sort of love song to Ukraine, which Hofstein lived in his whole life and which he loved. Okay, so different meanings of hefker. Here's another use, and this is a poem by the very beautiful Hadia Miladovsky, who is left Eastern Europe and settled in New York, Most of her poetry has been translated by Catherine Hellerstein, and if you're interested in women's poetry from the 20s and 30s, have a look. This one was not translated by Catherine Hellerstein. So this is a poem about a prison ship called El Chaco. It originated in Argentina. This is a fact. She didn't make it up. And it had like strikers and deportees and political activists. And it wasn't allowed to dock anywhere. It was just sort of sent out on the ocean, presumably for everyone on it to die. And if you recall, this is from 1931, if you recall, the rabbis said that the oceans are naturally ownerless, and look what Molodowsky does with that. She says, the ship sails against wind and sky, iron waves wreathed in prison bars, cannon snouts hunt the ship down on the furthest, widest ocean. The ship sails against wind and sky, and the wild waters welcome it to their common lot, abandonment, hefker. So here's another use of the term, which I found fascinating. This is the poem in Yiddish. We'll skip that. Ordinary journalists use the term. So you can now do searches in Yiddish of keywords, which you couldn't do 15 years ago. So me and various research assistants did this. And Yiddish newspapers in New York in 1919 used this word all the time. Wie in a hefker Wald, like in an abandoned forest, was Gott verloren hat von Blick, which God abandoned from his oversight. So there's hefker. Wie soll a Yid, a Jew, is hefker in Poland? How a Jew is hefker, abandoned, rightless, disavowed, dispossessed, up for grabs. So this was a very widely circulating term used by ordinary people, used by poets, used by newspaper reporters. Okay, what's happening? Another amazing and wonderful source for literature written in response to these events of mass public violence is by the poet Leib Kvitko, who wrote a collection called 1919 or 1919, and the cover art, the graphics from this period are amazing. And Kvitko said a really interesting thing. He said, "Die Reges seien anders." The moments were different. In pogrom time, time was different. The experience, there was no daily life. There was no sense of a calendar. There was no sense of order. And that phrase, the moments were different, sort of carried me into my current project on temporal experience of wartime in current Ukrainian poetry. How are the moments different, and how do Ukrainian authors, I'm not working on abandonment anymore, but how do they express that difference in their work? So Leib Kvitko went on to be a children's author, and a lot of sort of stock Soviet children's literature is actually Russian translations of his Yiddish work. There's a poem about piglets, there's a poem about a famous Soviet colonel, lots and lots and lots of illustrated stories and poems by Kvitko, by Kipnis and others were originally written in Yiddish, then translated into Russian, and then sort of entered the canon of Soviet children's literature. And we can speculate later as to why these great chroniclers of mass destruction turned to children's literature for the rest of their careers. There are many reasons. Okay. So one of the poems that Kvitko wrote, which I found very moving and interesting testament, was, remember before I said that making lists of the dead was something that relief workers did, and here's the Russian word spisuk or list, and here's the guy we saw earlier, Frank, 28 years old, a tailor. So Kvitko writes about list making. And he says, An unglücklich Verbliebener, an unlucky survivor, will count the dead. He will write my dead name with all the others in tiny letters on a long list. Oh, let him not forget. Wie viel ich bin alt gewesen, to record my age on that long list. Vico didn't die, but he's imagining someone who wants not only his name, but all his emotions and his will to live to be preserved somehow in that list. I just found it a remarkably moving and really interesting poem. Okay, let's let me change venues completely. This is not a Jewish guy. This is not a Yiddish speaker. This is a really interesting figure named William Ambrose Shedd, who was a missionary in northern Iran, who, as Shklovsky reports, went around counting the dead left behind by the Russian Imperial Army, who massacred Kurds, who massacred Persians. Persians and Kurds massacred each other. Assyrians were massacred. And this guy, who went to university at Princeton but was born in northern Iran and spent most of his life there, went around and simply noted, this many people are dead over here, this many children are dead over here, and he tried to offer safe space in the grounds of the American embassy. He wasn't that successful, but you wouldn't imagine it, but Victor Shklovsky, who writes about how art is made of devices and formal patterns, dedicated his entire sentimental journey, which is his account of his time in revolutionary Russia. He dedicates it to Dr. Shedd for the extraordinary work that he did, the care that he took. And I'm going to change geography again, and I'm moving towards the end of this presentation. A contemporary black woman author named Eve Ewing wrote a pogrom cycle. I almost said a pogrom cycle. Wrote a cycle of poems called 1919. And it's based on Chicago's July 1919 race riot. And it uses the 1922 report, The Negro in Chicago, as her interlocutor. So she takes sections of this report and then she transforms them into poetry. The riot began when a 17-year-old black youth accidentally violated some non-existent boundaries separating white and black swimming areas. He was killed by a white stone thrower, and the police didn't do anything about it. 1,000 people ended up losing their homes. 1919, you know, there's no FEMA. Well, we practically don't have FEMA anymore, but it was ruin. Your life was ruined if you lost your home. So she, Eve Ewing, who lives in Chicago today, her 1919 volume transforms violence into hope. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Chicago report was that one of the solutions was, well, let's just deport the black population to Africa, then we won't have race riots. So she writes this poem in which she says, you hope for a solution through the dying out of the Negro race. And as the stanza continues, Ewing rewrites these lines and she arrives at, you said hope. So the last line excerpts three crucial words, you said hope, changing their meaning so that hope changes direction, not against blacks, but for them. So the poem puts this message of hope into a formally hate-filled speaker. So, you know, poems can do a lot, and I just want to acknowledge that today Ukrainian poets are publishing tons and tons of really exciting, interesting work in Ukrainian on Facebook every day. It's impossible to keep up. And poetry is a form of hope today as we witness this horrible bombing of infrastructure, destruction of life, and more. So it's not just relief work that helps people, it's the expression and conceptualization of different forms of solidarity, conceptualization of what is happening to me, what does this violence mean, and this conceptualization and expression can take the form of documents, questionnaires, lists, and it can also take the form of literary work, poetry, in other words. So the works, just to sum up, that I discuss in this book elaborate the meanings of hefker as freedom, openness, wildness, but also dispossession, abandonment, and rightlessness. And my argument is that even amid abandonment, poems, the documentary reports, the lists constitute a form of care. That all of these people were trying to remove victims from a zone of abandonment to a realm of care, even if only took minimal form in the sense of counting the dead, and then writing a poem about those lists. Thank you.
Yeah, so just a quick comment and a question. And I'm not a scholar in this area at all. I'm an engineer. So the comment is about Petrushka. I have a theory. Okay. So it's a common character in a puppet, and so it's known for its wildness and rulelessness, and it's sort of provocateur. And maybe when it doesn't have somebody to operate him, that's when analogy comes from. But the question is about lack of rule and lack of ownership. I'm not sure these are equivalent. You can own without there be a rule that defines ownership. Your family, there's no rule to say you do not have your family, you have your family, for example. So it just got me thinking that rulelessness is not the same as ownerlessness.
Correct, but the meaning expanded. So when people, the original meaning of the term hefker was an ownerless object, but speakers used the word beyond its original narrow legal meaning to indicate chaos, arbitrary rule, and this Herrschaft, this rulerlessness. So no, in its narrow meaning, and you're right, the two things are not the same. Ownerlessness and the lack of government are not the same thing, because the government doesn't own the population. But the term expanded beyond its original meaning, and anarchy and Hefkerdigkeit, or the condition of ownerlessness, came to be seen as overlapping. And in fact, anarchists of the period used the word in a positive sense. We're just going to throw aside all the shackles of rule and limits and boundaries, and we're going to be free. So yes, thank you, yes.
One of the poets I know for a fact that you had in your study was part of the Night of the Murdered Poets in the Stalinist Purge. Maybe two of them, I recognize them from that. And the logic of that purge has something to do with abandonment. I was wondering if you could just talk about this idea of that it's impossible for them to be sort of good Soviets, being members of it, being betrayed in this sort of sense. And is there a logic to the Stalinist purge that also obtains? Many of the examples you're talking about seem to be coming from that 1919 era.
They're all
sort of this moment of that formation and that problem of what is the Soviet going to look like? What is the state going to be? What is property in that state? What are citizens? What are rights? And you talk about the stripping away, but there's also this kind of sense of that rights get conferred and sometimes and they get stripped away. Mm-hmm. I kept thinking about, there's a famous passage in Moby Dick called Fast Fish and Loose Fish, where he's talking about the law of the sea. Mm-hmm. And what is up for grabs. Mm-hmm. And he talks about what was Spain what was the New World when Spain stuck a harpoon in it and claimed it at the time of Columbus. And then he ends it, what are you, dear reader, but a fast fish and a loose fish also.
Great.
So it's this idea that we inhabit both conditions of ownership and disownership, or the potential of it is there in the Melville. It's also in this kind of course of history.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking about, like, so how do you think about, like, that 1919 moment and then the Stalinist moments and the others?
Okay, this is not a small question. Melville is amazing. Melville is awesome. So this Kvitko, Hofstein, and Markish were all executed on August 8th, 1952. It's known as the Night of the Murdered Poets, but not all the poets were murdered. So, for example, this gentleman here, Kipnis, who wrote Months and Days, was not murdered. And there were people who were not poets who were also killed in this moment. I actually think they're quite distinct. Yeah. Markish and Hofstein and Kvitko were members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, which had become something of an almost quasi-governmental agency in World War II era Soviet Union and had achieved international status. And it is not surprising that a paranoid like Stalin would not want any competitor for prestige and authority in his realm. You know, he had purged Ukrainians and Lithuanians and Crimean Tatars and many, many, many other populations way before 1952. So I think that, yes, in some very abstract sense, he's an example of that right to kill that is the basis, according to certain theorists, of all sovereignty, even democratic sovereignty. But I think the historical conditions of 1952 were quite distinct from the historical conditions of the 1917 to 1923 period in the Russian Empire, Ukraine, Poland, and Belarus, where, you know, it would be possible that in order to cross the street, you would have to show ID papers to 5 different quasi, you know, self-proclaimed authorities. That chaos was not there in post-World War II Stalinist Russia. There was order there. But he writes, you know, you couldn't exactly write everything. No, he does a really interesting thing. His first published work, Months and Days, is about this pogrom, but it's also as this passionate, sensuous love story. He had just gotten married. And in this novel, he really attacks Jewish observance and attacks his father. He couldn't stand his father. They didn't get along. And as time passes, he gets more sort of memorial, halo-like about his native town. And one of the later things that he wrote is called Mein Städtele Slaveshno, My Little Town, and there everything is just rosy and harmonious and glowing and warm and lovely. But I mean, Kipnis didn't write about the Stalinist experience. He wrote about the experience of German occupation, and he also expressed joy at revenge. I mean, he was a really vociferous, you know, sort of gut writer. And when Germans were hanged in Kiev in the late 1940s, he said, "My heart leapt, my eye danced," and it's that sort of revenge and rage was very largely suppressed in Western accounts of the Holocaust. So it kind of sticks out, but I don't. There is a book called Yizker, or Memorial, by Shmuel Gordon, another Yiddish writer who was not killed. And it does talk about that period, but it's like 800 pages and I haven't read it. And it's not in English. And I'm not going to translate.
So I believe in the presentation you mentioned how people experience time differently during times of war and conflict. So I was wondering how that relates to the publication that you're currently working on about the temporal experience in the modern Ukraine war.
So everyone, I mean, not everyone, but the people I've worked on, first of all, have described the month of February as a month that exceeded its boundaries. And there's a poem, there's many poems, and the word in Ukrainian for February actually also means like ferocious, luty. So there's already like a pun there in the word itself. So there's a kind of a narrative poem by Luba Yakimchuk about someone who had COVID, and during her COVID, Russia invaded, and she starts naming facts that took place on the 71st of February. So February just expands its boundaries. Time doesn't get organized into neat packages. This other poet, Oleg Kotsarov, talks about how time sort of sputters, split in two, went through gyrations, and then reverted back to sort of archaic cycles. Another poet talks about the impossibility of distinguishing one day from another, and in the poem she writes, Iakiva, she's a seamstress, and she's kind of sewing necks and limbs into this kind of mannequin figures of the days, so that you can separate one. One of the most well-known, he's a poet and a rock star, Jadon, has talked about the timelessness of the present, that time is just frozen, it doesn't flow anymore, and we're stuck in these instants of now, and we're losing our sense of the past. And this also comes up in a poem about an air raid by Kiva also. So the study is about waiting for war, waiting during war, the collapse of time during war, and attention and failure to pay attention to danger during war, and then, so far.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One of the things I'm curious about is that, life in the shtetl before, with obvious episodic events, you're pretty far removed from the stage, right? You don't have a particular regard of the state's pretension to care, and so I'm wondering if that's true. If I'm reading that correctly, what is the view of these writers of the state's responsibility to care, and then how was that horribly disrupted in 1919? And then, if I may, that's one question. The second question is, we talked a lot in class about joint, and I think probably the audience would appreciate hearing a bit more about your use of joint sources and what joint did, and are the survivors of the pogroms, do they feel like joint is fulfilling this capacity of care? Do they feel less abandoned because of joint's activities to both catalog what had happened, but also provide something in the way, as you remarked repeatedly, highly insufficient, but nevertheless provide something in the way of food and clothing and medicine and things like that?
So it's interesting that the author I've brought up several times, Kipnis, his pogrom novella, which comes out in several versions, but the good version is the 1929. The more literary one is 1921, and he writes in this direct style. He kind of accuses the reader, and he has one line like, "What? You didn't think we knew there was a revolution going on? Of course we knew there was a revolution. The revolution happened everywhere. The laws changed. Prior I mean, so now we have to go back to before World War I. Most of the Jews living in the former Pale of Settlement were incredibly poor, uneducated in public, they could not get to gymnasia and university. It was very unusual. And they performed backbreaking labor to survive. So Kipnis's mother-in-law took like plates and pots and pans in a sack over her shoulder and walked to the nearby villages to sell pots and pans. I mean, there were some people owned pharmacies, some people owned factories or breweries, they were the wealthy, but those were the vast minority. Much of Yiddish literature from the 1870s, 80s, 90s, turn of the 20th century is about very poor people and the distortions of their lives in these circumstances. We're talking about sort of pre-banking. I mean, there were banks in St. Petersburg. There were no banks for Jews living in a shtetl. If the railroad came, you might, get some trade going. But other than that, the men's aspiration was to study. There were these little grocery stores that sold like virtually nothing. I mean, it was a real subsistence kind of life. So I think a notion of the state's responsibility, the Tsarist state really did not enact its responsibilities. I mean, it demanded service, right, from every layer of society, but it didn't really fulfill responsibilities in a sense of a public sphere responsibility. Now, immediately after the mass public killing ceased, and there was the Joint Distribution Committee, was a committee to aid victims of pogroms. There were many other smaller agencies and groups. The Yiddish Culturally, Kulturliga maintained libraries and schools. They had nothing to do with revolutionary or socialist, building socialism. Some of these agencies did. I can't say whether people felt that their lives, were better because of the care that they had received. I would say that most people were so thoroughly traumatized that, yes, maybe you got a sweater or a coat, or you got a meal, or maybe you were offered a place to take a course so that you could gain a profession. But how many people had the capacity to actually take advantage of those things? So I have no way of telling you whether people felt that aid workers, distribution, record keeping, sweater distribution. One of the truly dismal reports I read was a Russian document that said, what we really need here are mobile psychiatric vans to go out to people because most of the women have been raped and they can't talk. And we really need to send experts to the site to therapize people, but of course that never happened. So I can't say, but there was this tremendous record keeping. Reams and reams of paper were produced, accounts, money sent, clothing sent, food packets, telegrams from the Central Steering Committee in Kiev out to the various localities, reports filed by aid workers, survivor accounts. I mean, there are 30 reels of microfilm that the Urbana-Champaign Library has on this Kiev pogrom aid committee generated. I mean, no one can really encompass it all. Do people have the capacity to take advantage of an opportunity of care that's offered to change their life? I mean, I worked as a social worker for Russian Jewish immigrants in Chicago in 1977 to 78. I was one of 4 who worked with Russian immigrants. I had 90 families under my care. I had no training. And I would say out of the 90 families, maybe 2 actually experience, oh, I can do what I want now. I'm free. Everyone else was, so where's my kid going to school? And how about the apartment? And my mom needs medical care. And why did you send me to that doctor? And this landlord is anti-Semitic. I had one family, young couple, and they said, we're going to save some money and buy a car. Can we drive around? I said, yes, go drive around. And they were able to experience freedom that they hadn't experienced before. But they were one family out of 90. I mean, dispossessed, dislocated people, yes, you gave the kid a bowl of potatoes, thank you. But my life is ruined. My life is ruined, basically, I think. Maybe I'm too pessimistic. Yeah.
Perhaps in a slightly similar vein, I'm interested in this idea of chains of ownership and changing enclosures of ownership. And specifically, was there an attempt by the Soviet state later to, I guess, in a sense, re-own or change, to utilize the narrative of these pogroms for state building purposes, to refashion them somehow into a memory of of protection, or we nothing like that?
The problem was that the state wasn't there on time.
Mm-hmm.
World War II, yes, you could say the Soviet army saved a lot of Jews, right? A lot of Jews died, but a lot of Jews got evacuated, and the Soviet army, not the American army, stopped Hitler in Europe. So you could say that.
They didn't.
Well, regardless, it wouldn't. That's how it felt. I mean, that it wasn't America that had saved Europe from Hitler. The Soviets went through the greatest sacrifice and stopped, but of course many millions of people were killed absolutely needlessly. Stalin was inactive for 8 full hours after Hitler invaded. Don't ask. This narrative, 19-teens, 1920s narrative, the state wasn't there.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, afterwards there were trials of perpetrators, but they were then all amnestied. So we quickly moved from accusation to amnesty too quickly, and there was no reconciliation or full acknowledgement, and everybody was deprived. People lost property and livelihoods and limbs, not just Jews. So it wasn't a great moment for self-serving state narratives here. World War II is a lot easier, to
But the
do.
Soviet state didn't want to speak specifically of Jews
No.
or anybody else. They wanted to speak of Soviet citizens.
Well, Yiddish writing Soviets could say that the Soviet army, World War II, defeated Hitler. And I think people felt that, and there were large numbers of Jews in the Soviet army. So I think they were sincere when they said that. But of course, official Soviet rhetoric was peaceful Soviet citizens were killed, not mentioning the word Jews. But Yiddish authors felt completely comfortable talking about Jews, and the Nuremberg trials were reported very widely every single day in Pravda. So if you wanted to learn about what happened to Jews in World War II, you could find out. So it's a very mixed story, and I think one of the graduate students I'm working with at Urbana is writing about how chaotic attempts, the chaos of the revolutionary period had to be sort of synthesized and homogenized. Mm-hmm. And
That's
early Soviet historians, did a lot of work to make these really conflicting accounts a kind of smooth narrative about, and if you read certain literary works, there arises this kind of man of steel who organizes the disorganized troops, and they go defeat the so-and-sos, and it's this total transformation. And it's obviously a propaganda job, right? Mm-hmm. Chaos is chaos.
Just on the term hefker, I know this presentation is about, the late 18th century onwards, so that's where most of the examples are going to be coming from. But I have seen the word once it was referencing, I believe, Brandenburg in the 14th century, where it referred to the status of a group of Jews as basically not beholden to any local lord in lands that they were passing through. So that was definitely a positive connotation. And I was just wondering, did it keep like a standard connotation between like, the 2nd century to the 1900s? Or?
No. It underwent significant change in this time because it never originally referenced behavior per se. It referenced objects and property that were literally left by the wayside. And to this day, it's used that way, and there are legal debates in the Jewish community about whether certain bodily products can be considered hefker, for example. Controversies about stem cell research and so forth. It underwent significant change in consideration of what happens to someone who assaults a slave that is half free and half not free and is of indeterminate status. They have no legal status. So the person who assaults them, there's no consequence. And there's theorization that the term, the word, the Greek figure Epicurus, the guy like live large, have fun. There's a Hebrew word epikursis, which means, abandoning the rules and the restraints on behavior. And scholars have theorized that there was a kind of merger between hefker, abandoned property, and hefker, abandoning God's commandments, and to reference behavior, wildness. And that happened early on, but I can't say exactly when. So it's one of these words that attracted a wide range of meanings, some of which conflict with one another, because I didn't dwell on this, but the same poets who we've been referencing, where are you? Come back. There you are. Okay, so this one in particular, Peretz Markish and also Hofstein, not so much Gritko, wrote a very famous poem in which he said, I am free, I am unchained, I belong to no one, I'm hefker. And it was about, I don't owe my community anything, I'm not beholden to the past, I can do whatever I want. And Hofstein, rather unflattering picture, had early poetry, right up through the pogrom period, in which he talked about how his poetry comes from these wild, abandoned fields where he gathers the seeds that others have sown. So it was an aesthetic or an arts-based term as well in the 1919s, 1920s. And you could use it to say, I don't have to write about the community, and I'm not beholden to what Dad does on the Sabbath, and I'm free. So it had this very positive meaning of unchaining yourself. So it's a rich word, and it itself is a word that you can't really be too certain about. It kind of, the ground shifts under your feet because it meant so many different things at different times, that even in the 1919 period, Hofstein, Markish, and others were proclaiming their hefkerness as poets. We're going to write poetry totally differently than the way it was done before. And people have worked on this.
One last question, at least for me. I don't know a great deal about David Hofstein. So could you had this maybe casual remark, but I'm still interested in it. You said he loved Ukraine. So what do you mean by that? What was his imagination of Ukraine? And then he leaves the Soviet Union, right? And then returns in 1926 to a different Ukraine. So what's his perception of Soviet Ukraine? And
he wrote a great many early poems about the landscape, and his landscape was Ukraine. It's greenery, it was trees, it was this kind of beautiful isolation, living in remote places. And he also, even in this pogrom cycle called Troyer, grief, or sorrow, talked about how Ukraine was a place of refuge, a Miklat, a place of refuge. And then we enter the period of like bloody banditry where anything went, anything goes. You could do whatever you want. There were no consequences. I mean, he lived in Kiev after, and there's a plaque on the building that he lived in, and this volume I'm editing with Gennady Estreich, a volume of essays about him, uses that plaque as the frontispiece. But he was interested in Ukrainian poetry, and he hung out with Ukrainian poets. And this guy over here, Kvitko, I mean, and Tychina, the great Ukrainian poet Tychina, they knew one another, and they translated each other's work. Hochstein was translated into Ukrainian and translated from Ukrainian. So there was admiration for the new kind of modernist forms of art and literature and theater that were common to both Yiddish and Ukrainian and Russian authors as well. Only these guys happened to, they were born in Ukraine and lived there and knew Ukrainian and interacted with Ukrainian artists a great deal. And the violence didn't interrupt that sort of that engagement and that interaction.
Well, thank you very much. Please join me today.
Thank you.